I think it's really cool when creators link their works together. I know we're well into an era of media where there's a whole ecology around finding Easter eggs and spotting hidden references. A lot of the blame for that can be laid at the feet of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. At a certain point in the MCU's nearly 2-decade-long run, it became mandatory to have at least read a summary of the story thus far, lest you flail contextless in a sea of nouns and events. Despite the fact that the project should have finished with Endgame, I think there's a nugget of creative wisdom in its initial success. It's fun to create a big, interconnected world. Spencer Campbell is one of the many people I credit with getting me to start making RPG videos. Once I read his sharply designed Slayers, I knew I had to find an excuse to talk about the wealth of brilliant works in the indie space. But in the years since I've covered Slayers and Rune, Campbell has embarked on a new project, one centered around his 2021 game Nova, in which players fly mech suits across a planet ruined by the explosion of its sun. Nova uses the lightweight Lumen SRD, also created by Campbell, giving players a suite of unique powers to take on the myriad factions of the setting. Campbell recently described himself as a toy maker, and I think that description is apt. In nearly all of his games, but especially with Nova, Campbell gives you big, shiny mechanical buttons to slam at a moment's notice, rocketing you toward a sci-fi power fantasy. While I think Campbell is a remarkable designer, the things that interest me personally are less about how well a design is implemented than the world it's implemented in. I'm a fantasy writer at heart, and if your world doesn't hook me, I'm gonna have a hard time playing in it, no matter how slick your rules are. But Campbell is appealing to my exact tastes. See, starting in roughly 2023, Campbell has been cranking out works in what he's termed the Novaverse. From companion games, to setting primers, to lore videos, even a short story, Campbell has been building the fiction of Nova into a dramatically expanded world. And as I've said before in my Wonderhome video, I'm a sucker for lore. I've gone through every entry in the Novaverse, sifted through Campbell's posts and implied snippets, and come up with some theories about the Novaverse itself. And while you certainly don't have to do all the homework I've done to understand the setting, I've pulled out some interesting snippets that I think are really fun about these interconnected works, and hopefully, we'll lay out some theories that will prove to be correct in the planned expansions to the universe. So the whole premise of Nova is that it takes place on planet Oberon, where, roughly 130 years ago, the sun blew up. Now, you'd be correct in thinking that that would cause some problems for the people of Oberon. They had to build bunkers and hide for a generation while firestorms scorched the surface. But pretty soon after the sun blew up, humanity emerged and began to salvage what remained of their planet. Things are certainly different from before. There's a bunch of weird, mutated critters, and above-ground farming is out of the question on account of the sun is gone. But actually, that's not so bad, considering Oberon should either be scorched to raw carbon or otherwise hurtling across the solar system, free from the star's gravity. Now, typically, I would completely overlook this detail. If the game's setting says the sun blew up and everything was mostly fine, I'd be along for the ride. It is deeply tedious when a commenter tries to solve a problem a work was not interested in addressing in the first place. But the thing is that Campbell brings up the detail of Oberon's gravity himself. In his lore video describing the Nova event, Campbell reveals a shocking truth. The sun is actually still there. It is simply hidden, obscured or corrupted by a strange entity only known by the people of Zed, the other inhabited planet in the solar system. This being is turning the rays of the sun into void light, the reason it is impossible to walk on the surface of Oberon without being irradiated and warped. Campbell claims that this entity has a number of names, the Void, the Maw, but one in particular, Druzhal's Grace, stands out. He states that the abduction of the sun is payment for a debt long owed. And most importantly, he states that the atrocities of Zed are the reason for this vengeance. Thankfully, he doesn't provide an answer for any of the numerous questions these statements pose, so I'd like to propose a theory. We know that Zed is no stranger to atrocity. Campbell reveals that there absolutely is a connection between Zed and the destruction of the sun. In his video which describes the Novaverse's timeline, he notes that 95 years before the Nova event, a strange energy spike was detected from Zed. At this point, Zed and Oberon had not been in contact for 75 years. Communications between the two planets had previously been disrupted and never reestablished. But this energy spike from the edge of the solar system coincided with the first major solar flare from Oberon's sun. These solar flares would increase dramatically over the next 90 years, always accompanied by an energy signature from Zed. These solar flares eventually culminated in the Nova event. It seems clear that Zed was doing something that directly resulted in the Novaverse's titular cataclysm. But what? And why? Campbell released a world primer alongside the January 2024 launch of Dusk, the second entry in the Novaverse. In that primer, we get confirmation that Zed is not only directly responsible for the destruction of Oberyn, but we also learn how they brought it about. Though Zed was cut off from the rest of humanity, they somehow acquired the power of the Void, harnessed dimensional rifts, and created an empire. It's hard to tell if Zed became a spacefaring empire or simply a planetary one, but either way, they became independently powerful, sacrificing their cousins on Oberyn to achieve technological and political advancement. Between this entry in the World Primer and the lore video linking Druzhal's grace to Zed, I think it's an easy leap to say that Zed somehow bound the progress of their civilization to the reality-altering powers of this entity. Now, the World Primer describes Zed as serving an abyssal master. Whatever the Zed Empire used to be, they are now thralls to some strange, malevolent force. However, I believe this malevolent force has shown up once before in Campbell's work. Not in Dusk, or even in Nova, but in the game in between, Rune. You see, in Campbell's third lore video, he describes the state of Oberyn when the first colonizers arrived on the planet, before the Nova event. While grateful to find a new home among the stars, they reported that the surface of Oberyn felt heavy, wounded, as if some great tragedy had left its mark long ago. As they continued their exploration, they discovered that the planet used to be populated. Tools, ancient cities, and eventually great tomb structures. The way Campbell describes these tombs makes it seem like they belong to important figures, similar to the pharaohs of Egypt or Mughal emperors. What does this have to do with Rune? Well, Rune was published in between Dusk and Nova, right as Elden Ring fever was sweeping the world. And what's interesting is that, in Campbell's body of work, the first time the word Oberyn appears in his games is in Rune. The world of Nova was originally described as a far future version of Earth in the 2021 original edition of the game. So if Rune is actually the genesis of the Novaverse, surely there must be some hint as to the condition of pre-Nova Oberyn in its text. Since Rune is borrowing from Elden Ring, you'll probably recognize some of their shared historical events. The Oberyn of Rune experienced a shattering, just like the lands between. Oberyn was consumed by a strange hunger, one which sounds a great deal like the maw that swallowed up the sun thousands of years later. The creatures responsible for this hunger broke Oberyn, shattering it for the crime of resisting their conquest. The magic or energy required to break Oberyn into the realms that would become the Rune worlds set these antagonists scurrying away from the planet, but they clearly want to return. The description of the zealot enemy in Rune suggests that the answer to the planet's fate lies in the stars, perhaps foreshadowing the theft of the sun. So my guess about how all this ties together is this. Pre-Nova Oberyn was first conquered by this hunger, which is the same thing as Druzhal's grace. The people of Oberyn managed to fight it off, so the hunger withdrew, shattering the world before it left, which causes Oberyn to feel heavy and wounded when people come to colonize it thousands of years later. However, Druzhal's grace only withdrew to another planet, Zed, where it kept vigil until the time that the planet was colonized. The people of Zed were contacted by Druzhal, and it gave them remarkable powers in exchange for technological advancement. Either because they were compelled, or because Druzhal offered them a deal, the people of Zed sacrificed their sun, allowing the entity to take its revenge on the inhabitants of Oberyn that spurned them so many years ago. The corruption of the sun is Druzhal's final push to reconquer Oberyn, to corrupt its life and people with its magic, and return to the planet that pushed it away. Now that we've sketched out a theory for what is truly happening with the sun, we can expand upon our premise by applying it to other aspects of the Novaverse. If the sun is not destroyed, but instead corrupted by Druzhal, what are we to make of its warped rays? See, though the sun is gone, Oberyn is still constantly bathed in void light, which is a kind of radiation emitted from the place the sun used to be. On its surface, it's a pretty easy jump to say, well, this void light is just another way for Druzhal to conquer Oberyn. And yeah, that would have been my conclusion too. Except for the fact that the void light has some side effects. Sure, it'll absolutely kill anyone who goes out in the dusk without protection, But originally, this void light created life instead of ending it. Specifically, Campbell credits void light with the animation of fungus on the surface of the planet, resulting in the rise of the Spore faction. The Spore are a sentient mycelium network. They're little mushroom guys that operate with a semi-shared consciousness. They're explicitly not a hive mind, but they can transfer thoughts to each other near instantaneously. Culturally, they behave much differently than you might expect from a bunch of mushrooms birthed from eldritch radiation. They're not predatory. Their network only accepts those who willingly give themselves to it. They're also very curious, as implied by their objectives in Dusk. They seek to understand more than they seek to grow. This faction is, of all the big players in the Novaverse, maybe the least hostile. Perhaps this is why Campbell predicts they're going to win the setting. But if we think about their function in fiction, it doesn't make sense for Druzhal to create the spores on purpose. It already has Zed at its command. It doesn't need foot soldiers. And because the spore are much more focused on cooperation and learning, they're not exactly going to be friendly to outsiders who seek a hostile takeover of their homeworld. Why would Druzhal intentionally create an oppositional force on a planet it seeks to occupy? Therefore, I think the spore are something different, a happy accident born of the tragedy of the Nova event, and, while a little culty, are mostly not malevolent. However, if culty is what you're looking for, there's plenty of weirdos in the various moon-worshipping lunar cults that have sprung up across the planet. These groups too have been affected by radiation, though in a different way than the spore. The lunar cult is an original Nova faction, featuring in the first iteration of the game. They're a bunch of freaks and I love them, but they're best known for exposing themselves to moonstone, or even piercing themselves with it, to acquire fantastic magical abilities. This exposure to moonstone corrodes their bodies, which is why so many of them rely on cybernetic prosthetics. The idea that moonstone is corrupting them is interesting to me, because, as you probably know, the reason the moon is able to shine at all is because it's reflecting sunlight. This presents a problem for the Novaverse, as the sun is, of course, not there. But the moon is, left in a fragmented state following the sun's corruption. My theory about Oberyn's moon is pretty simple. During the Nova event, the moon absorbed a great deal of energy from the residual radiation from Druzhal's corruption. Perhaps one giant solar flare, infused with void magic, careened into the moon, breaking it into pieces, but also empowered it to shine with its own pale light. If you've ever seen pictures of uranium dinnerware, that's kind of what I'm talking about. This also solves a problem I haven't yet brought up. The main energy source in the Novaverse comes from sunshards. They're what gives the spark suits their power, and the whole cities are built around especially large ones. Furthermore, these sunshards protect humans from the damaging void light that otherwise burns all life on Oberyn. This is why these shards are so vital to every faction on the planet. The vast majority of them cannot live without protection from these giant crystals. The setting of Nova would have you believe that these sunshards are exactly that, remnants of the sun that crashed into the planet. But Campbell himself has said in a Blue Sky thread that this is not the case. Suns are famously made of gas, not crystal. I propose a simpler solution. They're moon shards, ones that have cooled down over hundreds of years, ones that are not constantly exposed to the full force of void light in space. Perhaps it's Oberyn's atmosphere, perhaps it's the old magic of the shattering, but I think it's much more likely that the sun shards are just what happens when pieces of the broken, irradiated moon fall down to the Earth. It would also explain why the lunar cultists hate the cities which depend on the sun shards so much. Their existence is sacrilege, and they view it as their duty to return those shards of the moon to their former glory. Lastly, I want to highlight the Corvids. Campbell as a creator has a fascination with crows. One of his very first games was a resistance system game called Corvid Court, where you play as bird-themed thieves doing various crimes. The Corvid Dominion is a bit of a transposition of Corvid Court into a sci-fi setting. Instead of a thieves' guild, the Corvids are now a full-blown galactic empire, full of colorful bird aliens with archetypical personalities. In Nova, they're described as militaristic and sneaky, making use of ambush and skirmish strategies to achieve victory. This makes sense. The Mongol Empire famously conquered much of Asia and Europe with similar tactics. But Campbell noted in one of his videos something that stood out to me beyond the historical parallels. While there were a few Corvid units operating on Oberyn around the time of the Nova event, The Dominion fleet actually arrived in the solar system 3 years following the sun's corruption. My question is, why? Why would such a powerful empire care about a single solar system? So there's an old Star Wars fan theory that popped up before Disney bought the franchise and recanonized the expanded universe. And to make a long story short, the theory is that the reason Emperor Palpatine wanted to build the Death Star was not to terrorize the galaxy, but to prepare it to fight a greater threat. In the EU, there's a species of aliens called the Yuuzhan Vong that are basically a combination of the Hellraiser aliens, the Predator, and Spartans. They're a warrior culture that loves pain and bloodshed, and they've bioengineered all their weapons and ships, so all of their technology is organic. They're a very silly concept, and also my favorite part of the EU. They're perfectly edgy and weird in a way that absolutely hit for teenage me. In these books, the Vong wage a years-long war against the New Republic, famously killing Chewbacca by dropping a moon on him. So the fan theory is that the Emperor, being a powerful space wizard, predicted the arrival of these murder aliens, and wanted to build the Death Star as a way to defeat them without the needless bloodshed that we see in the EU novels. I think this theory is extremely fun, and it gives me an idea for what the Corvids are up to in the Novaverse. Consider the situation of the Corvid Dominion. Humanity does not appear to have anything close to resembling a galactic empire in the same way the Corvids do. However, between the colonization of Zed and the destruction of the Sun, humanity, or whatever malignant forces command it, appear to have technological capacities far greater than previously estimated. The Corvids are no longer unchallenged as galactic hegemon. We know that even before the Nova event, Corvid spies had been embedded on Oberyn. I suspect that those spies studied the strange energy spikes and artificial solar flares created by Zed/Druzhal, and reported back to their superiors that something was up. That's why a whole Corvid battle group arrives in the Nova system so relatively soon after the sun is corrupted. They want to study this strange new technology and utilize it against this upstart empire of Zed. This theory has some backing in that Campbell has repeatedly made two things about the Corvids clear. They are obsessed with maps, and they love to steal. I made brief reference at the beginning of this essay to the tomb structures that littered Oberyn, speculating that they were first connected to the setting of Rune. What I failed to mention is that on pre-Nova Oberyn, when the first human colonizers of the planet found these tombs, one of them was already smashed open, with a laboratory inside. We also know from the Dusk Denizens lore expansions that one particular Corvid managed to steal a prototype spark from humanity, so there's clearly some interest in human technology, both before and after the Nova event. Furthermore, in the short story Campbell wrote about the first spark, we see that the pilot is ambushed by a Corvid agent, who is notably poking around the mapping probes that the sparks use to document the surface of Oberyn. Side note, I want all of us in the indie scene to make more straight-up fiction in our worlds. I think it's so fun and helps us sketch out the kinds of play we imagine our games will create. Anyway, I think the Corvids are looking for something specifically to do with harnessing the energy of the sunshards. Between their interest in digging up old Oberyn tech, their raids on spark pilots in sunshard cities, and their suspicious appearance very soon after the Nova event, I think the Corvids are nervous. They can smell a new threat rising in the form of Zed. And much like the cuckoo bird, they're eager to murder their rivals before they hatch. So those are my theories about the Novaverse. I have zero idea whether or not they'll come true, but if I'm even partially correct, I'll be pretty psyched. One last thing before I sign off, I would love for other folks to do this sort of thing for indie creators. Indie designers put such care and attention into their works, and I think it is so fun to pitch headcanons and conspiracies about game worlds, to draw your own little connections where perhaps nothing exists. It both incentivizes creators to make more work, to flesh out their worlds in bigger ways, as well as shows them that there's a fan community who cares about what they do. It doesn't have to be a whole YouTube video, though I'd love if that was the case. It could be a comment on Itch.io, it could be a deranged Tumblr post, hell, write your own fan fiction about games. I just think that fan theories are fun and a creative way to engage with someone's work, and our whole RPG community would be a more enthusiastic place with your input. Thanks to everybody for watching. I really appreciate anyone who takes the time to see what I'm saying about tabletop games. The names of the people who make these videos possible are scrolling by right now. If you want to become one of those people who helps me keep the channel going, you can join my Patreon, where members will get access to all my games, as well as the option to vote on a special video for the end of the year. That's going to be coming up here in June, so if you want an option to make me do a game, or cover a game, that'll that's coming up. So get on it. Chop chop. My background picture is Liquefied Image by Adrian on Unsplash, and my profile picture is by Eater Outsider on Tumblr. If you want to find more of my work, I'm at aavoid on Blue Sky, Monster Factory Fanfic on Tumblr, but my main site is aavoid.com, where I talk about games and writing. I also do a podcast, Mortified the Friendship Quest, where me and my friend Layla do critical media analysis. When this video comes out, we'll release our episode on Bahubali 2, which is just a really fun piece of Telugu cinema. It's just a great time, so I'm looking forward to releasing that conversation. Thanks again, as always, for watching. I will catch you all for the next video. Until then, see ya.